All right, welcome back. Welcome back to our last session, session 8, where we will explore the topic nature-based solutions for climate, disaster, and community resilience. Great. So I'm Meredith Hovis. I'm a graduate student at NC State and the program coordinator for SCDRP. I will be the moderator for this session. Thank you all for joining this annual meeting, and I hope you are able to take away lessons and ideas from this meeting back to your work, to your communities, in hopes of becoming more resilient. And we're excited to go out with a bang with this last amazing session. So this session seeks to increase the implementation and awareness of nature-based solutions, also referred to as natural infrastructure or green infrastructure, an understanding of how, where, and at what scale they are happening. We also seek to understand efficiencies gained from streamlined permitting and how we can employ nature-based solutions to protect vulnerable and resourced communities. So last year at this same meeting in 2021, we held a similar session on nature-based solutions. But this year we want to take it a step further. Instead of discussing what nature-based solutions are, we are looking to institutional arrangements to understand the establishment and implementation and management of nature-based solutions. So historically in the Southeast, US Southeast, hazard mitigation has been dominated using hard engineered structures like levees and dams, or also referred to as gray infrastructure. Gray referring to the color of rocks or concretes often used in the construction of these structures. But extensive literature has criticized gray infrastructure for its adverse effects on ecological processes. And a growing body of literature is questioning whether a sole reliance on this gray infrastructure tactics for hazard mitigation is appropriate. In 2016, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, defined nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage, restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal changes effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So nature-based solutions such as restoring wetlands or afforestation, planting forests, or using cover crops can benefit the impacts from flooding or water quality. So today we will hear from a whole host of perspectives on nature-based solutions and how they're helping climate adaptation, disaster resilience, and communities. Today in the session, we have Dr. Amanda Treidinger with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with the program Engineering with Nature, Sarah Watling with FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, BRIC program, Roberto Vickiera with Los Protectores de Cuencas, and then Blair Williams with the South Carolina Coastal Management Program, and then finally Rich Brown with Bank of America. And so we will get started here first. Just some housekeeping, I guess. Please post any questions in the question and chat box. This session will consist of these 5 speakers and will be followed by a few minutes of questions. So we will not have a discussion or panel at the end. We'll have questions directly after each of these speakers' presentations. So without further delay, let's get started. And with this session, this is the last session of our meeting, right? I introduced Dr. Amanda Treidinger, who is an engineer and assistant project manager of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers program, Engineering with Nature. Amanda, thanks for being here today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm being told there might be some difficulties. Okay, nope. Hopefully you can see me now. Okay, great. Yeah, so my name is Amanda Treidinger. Thank you for the introduction. My background is environmental engineering and coastal and oceanographic engineering. So the 3 of those degrees kind of met a trifecta in the middle, and placed me in the right time and right place to take over the assistant program management of the Engineering with Nature program at the USAFE Engineering and Research Development Center. And I'm very lucky and very happy to do that. I'm going to spend 10 minutes here just running through the program, and then I'd love to just open the chat to answer any questions, anything I missed, and hopefully create some follow-up opportunities. So I'll go to the next slide. So the Engineering with Nature program is essentially it's an initiative to intentionally align our natural and engineering processes. So we seek to apply the ideas and develop innovative infrastructure that works with nature instead of against it. And we aim for the natural and the flexible, and we want to include all of those different types of features in that innovative infrastructure that Meredith just mentioned. So nature-based solutions, or NBS, natural infrastructure, NI, green infrastructure, NNBF, natural nature-based features, all of the above. Our goal is to incorporate that in the policy, the research, application of the USAFE and of the nation's infrastructure building for flood risk management and community resiliency planning. And these are our key elements of the program and of the initiative. Overall, EWN is aiming to have holistic, system-based approaches to create sustainable, science-based, highly collaborative resiliency design and guidance for the nation and internationally as well. I'll go to the next slide. So the heart of innovation is through change. And even change for the better will confront many obstacles. So Engineering with Nature has highlighted these 5 solutions to those obstacles to overcome and try to improve our USAFE infrastructure, organization, and institution. So those innovations of practice are policy development, engagement, partnering, and teaming up with both interorganizationally. So we have different labs at the ERDC, the Engineering Research and Development Center. We have the Environmental Lab, the Coastal Hydraulics Lab, Cold Regions Lab, and we are making sure that we, through this program, partner with all of those labs, but we also partner outside of ERDC with USAFE districts and divisions, the engineers and planners that are working day-to-day in the field, implementing the research that's happening at ERDC. And then we're also looking to partner with other federal agencies and state organizations and academia. So we don't want to hold tight to any information that we stumble upon, any successes or failures. We want to share all of the in-depth research that we're doing at ERDC as much as possible. And we can only do that through engagement and partnering. And like I mentioned, research and development, we are a research and development center. So that's where we focus a lot of our energy. We also incorporate on-the-ground projects and demonstrations so that we can practice what we preach and support case studies that will then inform the research that will go back to case studies and make sure that we continue that holistic, iterative approach. And then lastly, every step of the way, we are being very strategic in our communications. Like I said, we don't want to hold tight to any findings. We're constantly working with our researchers to develop deliverables that can go outside the walls of the USAFE castle. And I'll talk about each one of these orange bullet points throughout this presentation and try to give an example that highlights each one of these strategies. So yeah, awesome. So in policy development, we're moving from one side of the spectrum to the other. Where on this little figure I have here, we have wild and free-flowing nature, and then on the other side of the spectrum is the tamed and constrained nature. And of course, there are a spectrum of approaches to implementing infrastructures in this country, from wild nature to what we think is tamed nature. And our intention with EWN is to rebalance nature and human through engineering and science and forge, like I said, collaboration is huge, forge a partnership between the two and thereby create more value from our infrastructure investments. So we also are recognizing that sometimes you can sit right in the middle of the spectrum as well. It doesn't have to be or, it doesn't have to be gray or green. It can be and we're having a fun time figuring out when that and applies. Okay, next slide. So this is the Network for Engineering with Nature, which is one of our engagement partnering and teamwork activities. As I mentioned, partnerships are huge for filling those knowledge gaps. And in the fall of 2020, we started a collaborative effort with the University of Georgia, and we've been working with them and different researchers from the Corps and engineers from the districts to develop a large-scale network that can help us accelerate innovation and knowledge transfer. We want to have R&D come out of this network, but we also want to make it highly educationally focused. So we've been working on, we have a monthly seminar that talks about our research that we're doing in the network. We have, we're developing an educational curriculum, and we're connecting. Since the University of Georgia, we've opened our doors to 8 additional partners, all kind of scattered there in the slide. And we're making sure to connect the professors at the other academia institutions that have reached out to us so that we can together recognize those gaps and figure out who the best teams are to fully fill those knowledge gaps. Next slide. So here I have an example of one of our research projects. I'll go to the next slide, which should have like a drawn tree on it. I'm not sure if maybe my computer's delayed. Yeah. So this is our research project that's actually been developed through the Network for Engineering with Nature, called Overcoming Barriers to Include Equity in Water Management. This is a team of ERDIC engineers, researchers, and then UGA, University of Georgia, anthropologists and scientists who are working together to more seamlessly integrate equity into standard planning frameworks for at-risk communities. And they've identified these 4 major barriers that exist when it comes to including equity in our water management infrastructure. And all of these have been addressed in a journal paper. A lot of these slides have web addresses that you can go to. I'll, at the end of my talk, pop a lot of these in the chat, but here at the https noon.org equity address, yeah, you can find this paper that has been published by all of the researchers you see below on operationalizing equity for integrated water resource management. It's a great paper, and my favorite part is this little tree on the right here that conceptualizes the look of equity in water management. So a lot of times you immediately notice the tree leaves and the branches, and you can easily see how this is distributed over, providing shade for the surrounding ground. And one solution is to distribute equity based on where you see those leaves. Another is to focus on wins and losses, who's even getting shade. And this is a great starting point to talk about benefits and outcomes. However, that tree can't grow without a trunk, and it can't get a strong foundation without roots. So where the trunk is an inclusion of your different voices, who needs to be at the table to say who's getting equity, your roots can then also represent how your system delivers the nourishment of growth. So this team is focusing on the roots and looking at how we need to talk to district engineers, USAID engineers, and planners. And, in your your engineering bachelor degree, nobody said, here's a lesson on social equity. There needs to be that conversation when we're starting at the planning stage and starting at the design point. So that paper focuses on how that might be accomplished. I can dive into that later, but I'm going to power through. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is an example of our on-the-ground project and demos. This is the 7 Mile Island Innovation Laboratory. So this is actually not only an example of on-the-ground work, but an example of research, collaboration, and policy adaptation. So the Innovation Lab addresses dredging and marsh restoration techniques through innovative research, collaboration, practical application. We get to apply the research that's done at the Engineering Research Development Center at this outdoor laboratory, study it, take it back, apply it, and see how the nearby communities are doing when we essentially do nearshore placement and monitor big-scale storm events. Why I'm saying that this is also a collaborative example is you can see there's quite a few people listed on the screen: the Nature Conservatory, the Wetlands Institute, Fish and Wildlife, DEP, New Jersey DEP, NOAA. Lots of folks are involved in this project. Again, I'll place some stuff on the chat. But this is also a Engineering with Nature proving ground where we've been identifying different districts throughout the nation to actively apply our research. So this is a research to ground implementation example, and I will throw in a link in the chat to show you what other proving grounds we have going on. But a lot of the research here that has been, a lot of the data we've discovered has kind of directly been implemented into WRDA policy. So we have incorporated the right people at USAFE HQ to be involved in this project, and we've been able to inform some decisions on the beneficial use side of policy. Next is a long list of research, and not a long list, this is a short list of some of the research and development projects we have going on through the Engineering with Nature program at ERDIC. We have remote sensing, we have model development, numerical model development, we have mangrove testing, which that's what there's a figure up here of a wave tank we have at the ERDIC facility where we did, I think it was 1 to 6 scale mangroves were created with PVC, and we put different wave frequencies through the mangroves, and we're able to capture the wave dissipation. Again, I got another link for that. I'll throw it in the chat so you can see more of our ongoing research projects. But I'm gonna, truck through. Strategic communications. So this is 2 of our Engineering with Nature atlases. These feature USAFE and non-USAFE projects. They're a really great tool to just pull off your bookshelf, and if you're working with a client that you still need to get on board with an NNBF or natural infrastructure, they have great pictures, great little, it's just nice to have something tangible to share with the people you're working with and prove to them that these things look good and provide social equity as well as protection. Next, I'm going to do a lot of strategic communication now. This is the international guidelines of the use of natural and nature-based features for flood risk management. This is published on our website as well. And essentially it breaks down into 4 different parts. We have international, national authors that helped out on this. Many different organizations got involved. And I'll go to the next slide. Essentially, each chapter works through the start to finish design of a NNBF and kind of gives links and POCs for subject matter experts and what the whole birth to creation to adaptive management plan looks like for an NNBF. Last strategic communication is we have a podcast, and that's on the next slide. This is, it's my job to be EWN, and I listen to this in my free time. It's a really well done podcast. We're on season 3, and you can get it everywhere. You can get a podcast. I listen on Spotify, and it's really fun to listen to. I will go to the end now and take any questions on anything I covered and drop links in chat.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And I apologize, my internet is going in and out, so hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Do we have any questions? Let me check the chat. Feel free to drop any questions in the chat. I do have one question while maybe we wait and see if anyone else has others, but I'm just curious, you mentioned using nature-based solutions for flood risk management, right? Is there anything else what other opportunities or co-benefits does the Army Corps excite about nature-based solutions other than for flood risk management?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the goals for Engineering with Nature is to have triple win, and it's part of our logo where we have 3 circles. Triple win benefits for all of our projects. Of course, there's the economical that comes with flood risk management, but they should also have social and ecological benefits as well. So, of course, there's a environmental benefit to having a nature-based feature versus, say, a seawall. You're creating habitat, you're creating biodiversity, and we actually have a few projects that we have one research project that makes the business case for an NBF based on existing use-based projects, and then we have one that's looking into basically quantifying what that biodiversity, increase in biodiversity is that you get. We have another research project that looks at 8 of our use-based existing flood risk management projects to find out how much blue carbon is being sequestered on those. And then one of our Network for Engineering with Nature projects is going through existing use-based pre-EWN projects to validate all those co-benefits. So there's many co-benefits. I'd say social, economical, and ecological. That's the trifecta of the EWN, the projects, the NNBF features.
Great. And one other question that was just sent to me, and then we'll head on to the next person. But this question is, what does EWN look like in 1 or 2 years if they have made progress? And what's one thing that you would present on next year if you have made meaningful progress? It's a good question.
Yeah, and really well timed. We've had quite a few 2022 EWN strategic planning meetings lately. So I'd say we have been successful, and if in this year, I'd say we've been successful in EWN if we've created an engineering curriculum using the professors at the different universities that I talked about, because actually the flood risk management for the Corps is kind of the most difficult benefit for us to quantify at the moment, because we have a lot of policy and we have a lot of measurements for risk reduction and cost savings. We don't have that at our fingertips the way that our policy is written and our 3x3s are done. We don't have that at our we don't have it as a tool for our engineers within USACE. So that's been a very huge goal for us, is to have a professional focused, both professional planning and professional engineers focused curriculum that helps engineers design these features. And then we want to focus a lot on equity, and we've noticed we want to focus on regional diversity. We have a lot of knowns on coastal and NBF. We want to focus on inlands. There's a lot of inlands in this country, and we want to show them some love.
Great.
Yeah, and just consistent and accessible resources for everyone.
Awesome. That is great. Thank you so much, Amanda. Thanks for being here today. There was also another question, but I'm going to put it in the chat, and maybe you can respond to it on the chat. I'll do that here in a second.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sounds great. Thanks for listening.
I don't want it to get lost. Okay, great. Thank you. So next up, we have Sarah Watling, who is a trained landscape architect and program analyst with FEMA's new grant program, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or the BRIC program. So thanks, Sarah. I'll pass things off to you.
Thank you so much. Next slide. And next slide. So BRIC is a 2-year program, and I'm assuming that everybody knows about it. So I'm just going to give us all some touchstones to think about the big picture here about what BRIC is. So BRIC's guiding principles are capability and capacity building, innovation, partnerships, large infrastructure projects, flexibility, and consistency. Next slide, please. And BRIC's hazard mitigation priorities are down at the bottom, these 6 bullets. So infrastructure again, disadvantaged communities, lifelines, nature-based solutions, climate, and building code adoption. Next slide. So BRIC, like I said, is 2 years old, and its first year was 500 million, and its second year we grew. We are 1 billion this year. Unfortunately, our grant cycle closes tomorrow, so if you don't have an application in, it might be a little too late for this year, but there's always next year. But this year, we have 3 pools of funds available, 56 million in the state and territory allocations, 25 million in the tribal set-aside, and 919 million in the national competition for mitigation grants. So the big show right there. And you can see on the left all of the different ways that these funds can be used. Next slide, please. So BRIC applications are assessed on 2 sets of criteria. There's technical criteria, which you can see here, these 8 for a total of 115 points. Grand total BRIC is 230 points. The technical criteria are all or nothing. So you get 0 or whatever the red numbers are in the circles in the top of all of these. And I want to focus us on nature-based solutions, which is worth 10 points, and on economically disadvantaged rural communities, which is worth 15 points. So economically disadvantaged rural communities are defined in the Stafford Act, which is what sort of mandates BRIC as many things, but one that is very important is the population size of 3,000 or less. So we're really bound to that. And next slide, please. It's a slight challenge because we have been selected as one of 21 pilot projects in the Justice 40 initiative, which is a piece of Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. So the nutshell for Justice 40 is that 40% of federal funds and benefits of those funds must reach disadvantaged communities. So disadvantaged communities are defined in these blue dots as these are interconnected and overlapping and stackable and just various stresses that communities experience, including low income, disproportionate climate impacts, distressed neighborhoods, and all of the other things that you can see here. So there's a difference between the ERDC, which is part of our Stafford Act mandate, and what Justice 40 is asking BRIC to do. So next slide, please. So to do that, we've made some changes between year 1 and year 2 in order to be responsive to Justice 40. So there's some funding amounts, which I talked about a little bit of terminology change, but a big important change is in the technical criteria. And another big important change is in the qualitative criteria, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. So the technical criteria changes are that economically disadvantaged rural communities now only have to provide a federal cost share of 10% versus 30% of all of the other applicants in the competition pool. So hopefully that's a meaningful difference to EDRCs. EDRCs, which we saw earlier, are awarded 15 points, which, 3,000 people or less compared to their peers. And in the first year, that was only worth 5 points, and we've tripled that. And this year, it's worth 15 points in order to sort of open the window a bit more to incentivize those communities to apply. And then the last change in the technical criteria is that prior participation in federal grant programs and projects. And one of those now included is direct technical assistance, which is a piece of the BRIC program, which I'll talk about more in the next slide. So we can go on to the next slide. So non-financial direct technical assistance is a very exciting piece of the BRIC program. So we understand that it is these massive infrastructure projects are really difficult to access, especially for communities that have some equity issues at play. So the Direct Technical Assistance Program is a solution to that. In the first year of BRIC, we selected 8 communities to participate in the program, and this year we're selecting up to 20 communities. As the grant program closes, the grant window closes tomorrow, so does the direct technical assistance application window close tomorrow. So if we're looking at the wheel on the right, at the top, there is community emails, DTA, letter of interest. So it's a very simple application process. It's a 2-page letter describing need, capacity, just very, very simple and straightforward, and you email it. And then if we go around the wheel to about 9 o'clock, we'll get a little more detail about what DTA is. So DTA is 1 to 3 year engagement, and it's technical assistance that goes BRIC to community, or FEMA to community directly. It's 40 weeks of technical assistance, and the goals are to get community capacity up into a place where they can submit high quality applications and where they can implement innovative projects that reduce risk. Next slide, please. So another strategy that we have available to support disadvantaged communities accessing the BRIC program are phased projects. So you can, if you have a scoped project, for instance, you can scope a project via BRIC grant from the allocation pool, then you can develop it a bit further and submit it as a phased project to the national competition. So phased project basically says this is the whole of the project. This is about what it's going to cost. This is about what it's going to do. And then the first phase of that, if you're awarded funds, allows the applicant to develop all of the engineering and the construction drawings and all of those things, which is too much of a risk burden for communities that don't have that kind of access. So if phase 1 goes well, then your second phase funds are released. So it's a really great strategy that underserved communities can think about. Next slide. Nature-based solutions, what we're here about. I don't think anybody needs me to tell them what they are. Next slide. But I do want to tell you about FEMA's new nature-based solutions webpage. So FEMA is pretty new to the nature-based solutions game, and we have federal peers, like we just heard from Amanda, with decades of experience doing this. But FEMA is there now, and we have produced this webpage that includes all kinds of information that would help an applicant submit an application for BRIC. Next slide. Sorry, next slide, thanks. So you can see here on the left how FEMA is defining nature-based solution, which is very similar to the way a lot of our peer agencies are also defining nature-based solutions. But I really want to refer you to this guide that was produced by FEMA, of course, Building Community Resilience with Nature-Based Solutions. And inside the guide, next page, next slide. These are all of the contents of this guide, and the green bar at the top, again, gives you the definition, but then also starts to talk about scale, which is really important in BRIC because it's the large infrastructure projects. So next slide. So we see here all kinds of typologies of nature-based solutions. We've got large, medium, and small. And to BRIC, the large and the medium are the very, very attractive ones, right? So if you see on the top right, a single rain garden at a site scale is not going to be successful inside of BRIC. BRIC is really looking at the watershed scale or the landscape scale or the neighborhood scale. So if you take a whole neighborhood and implement rain gardens throughout the neighborhood, then we're having a different conversation, and we're getting into the level and the scale and scope that BRIC is trying to hit. Next slide. So qualitative criteria. So there are a few changes that were made between year 1 and year 2 here in order to achieve our Justice 40 obligations. And you can see inside of population impacted, outreach activities, and leveraging partners. So this set of criteria, these are not all or nothing. These are based on a scale. These are peer reviewed. So once your application comes in, it's peer reviewed. And inside of those 3 criteria that I just mentioned, there's a lot of space for your narrative to include details about how your project is reaching underserved communities, as described in the earlier slide with all of the overlapping bubbles. But I also want to talk and focus us on climate change and future conditions. So climate change and future conditions as a category, as a criteria, 100% of the first year selections included information about climate change and future conditions. So it is an incredible competitive advantage in your application. So if you're putting an application together, please consider including this kind of information and thinking in your application. Next slide. So future conditions, climate changes, population changes, demographic changes, land use changes, all of those kinds of things. Next slide. And these are a lot of the hazard types that FEMA and BRIC and other organizations are responding to from climate change. And right now, we're really looking at diversifying this list of hazard types that we are responding to. So for instance, extreme heat. And we think that diversification of hazard types is another way that we can reach some of our equity goals. Next slide. So the Mitigation Action Portfolio is a really excellent resource that's really full of case studies that are FEMA funded and other federal agency funded big projects that are sort of BRIC-ish. So I'm pointing to it as a resource if you need to see a case study and find some inspiration about what a project could look like. Next slide. And here's the table of contents, and you can see the green leaves that show the nature-based solutions project. So again, nature-based solutions is, while FEMA is new to it, we are taking it very seriously, and it is very attractive to our grant program. Similar to future conditions, 80% of the selections from our first year of selected projects included nature-based solutions. So it's also a competitive advantage issue. So if you're putting together an application, definitely get nature-based solutions in there. Next slide. Another really major piece of our program and our equity work is the partnership framework. So this is showing up everywhere. We hear everybody talking about this all the time, but two really specific things that our partnership group within BRIC is doing towards equity is we're identifying and formalizing partnerships with match partners. So we know that even that 10% match might be out of reach for some communities, and we're identifying partners who fund this kind of work, and then we're trying to be matchmakers and make those connections so more communities can have access to this stuff. And the other thing that we're doing is we're really trying to partner with our federal peer agencies to make sure that A, we're leveraging their existing knowledge, and B, we're not duplicative of their program. So we're really trying to integrate our program with what's already out there. So next slide, and I think this will be the last one. So big plug for the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative, which is a huge place that me as nature-based solutions person, we're formalizing partnership here with this group. I think there are a lot of people on this call who are probably associated with these agencies. And I just want to make a big plug that in November 2021, the Green Infrastructure Federal Collaborative did an excellent webinar, including funding sources and types and methods and all of that kind of stuff from all of these organizations. So it's an excellent, excellent resource if you're trying to fund a nature-based solutions project, or if you know someone that is and you're trying to support them. So that's it. I'll leave it there and love to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for talking about this program. I'll wait to see if anyone has a question.
I also dropped a ton of links in there because I talked a little bit about a lot of things. So grab those links if you want more information about stuff.
Great. And you have your email address on this as well, right? Somewhere where folks can email you if they have additional follow-up questions.
I don't, but it's sarah.watling@fema.dhs.gov, and you can find me, and I'll absolutely be happy to chat more about stuff.
Great. We do have one question from Karen Collins. Says, how does the match program work? And do you have any links or contacts for that?
So it's informal right now, but it's a requirement that if you're an EDRC, you have to provide 10% non-federal match for your total grant. So if your grant total is $1 million, 10% of that you have to provide yourself from other sources. And so what we're working on is identifying partners that are interested in specific pieces that, philanthropy or whatever, that align with their own mission spaces, that are looking for partners for projects to fund, and then we're trying to match make that. So it's informal and it's getting off the ground now, but be aware of it. And as programs, as you're developing applications, communicate with your regions, your regional FEMA people about this kind of stuff.
This is great. And maybe just one more question here that, and then we'll go on to the next speaker. And thinking about partnerships, can you think of a current example of a successful public and private partnership, meaning where a private sector partner was meaningfully involved in a project? Had a case.
In a project, there are tons and tons of examples, and actually you can look on the Fema BRIC webpage and see some summaries of the selected projects this year. And one that is coming to mind really clearly is, it's called Lumberton Loop. And it is a multi-year project that, you know, just everybody got involved, and it's really, really amazing. And BRIC funded just a piece of it, you know, so much of it was already complete, but that's a great example. And then another great example is, you know, there are various philanthropies that have a lot of academic and other horsepower in this department who collaborate with us regularly in terms of, you know, this is how we're interpreting and analyzing your program, and we take that seriously, and we are really you know, looking for everybody to be involved in this. It's such a huge, important program.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to put the Lumberton Loop example in the chat here, just so people can follow up with that. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. All right, next I introduce Roberto Vickiera, who is the Executive Director of Protectores de Cuencas, which is a community-based nonprofit organization that helps restore and conserve ecosystems in watersheds in Puerto Rico. So thank you for being here today, Roberto, and whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be in here. Yeah, so the next slide, please. So I am the director of a nonprofit organization that has been working in Puerto Rico since 2012. Our NGO works directly with planning at a watershed scale, but also in the implementation of projects for reduced land-based sources of pollution, mainly to protect the marine environment ecosystems. Next. So we are going to talk about some examples of nature-based infrastructure concentrated in a small island of Puerto Rico called Culebra, approximately 11 square miles and roughly 2,000 residents. It's a highly tourist destination nationwide in Puerto Rico, but also internationally. It is also declared a priority for conservation with several NOAA programs, particularly the Restoration Center and the NOAA Coral Reef Conservation Program. And based on those important features, Culebra was selected as a priority, and we participated in the development of a Culebra Watershed Action Plan. Next. So Culebra is surrounded by the most pristine coral reefs present here in Puerto Rico, so that's why it's so important to protect them. Next. Okay, so that watershed management plan integrated the community in all of the aspects, particularly in the recommendations of future actions or integrated watershed management actions. The plan was finished in 2014, although we have been implemented pilot projects in Culebra since 2011. Next. Main sources of pollution identified in Culebra are sediments and excess of nutrients coming down on our marine environment. The sediment mainly comes from the dirt road system in Culebra, in slopes that are more than 40% sometimes in several areas. Most of the dirt roads in Culebra, more than 90% of the dirt road of the road network in Culebra are dirt roads. Next. These are some of the examples of how sediment sources were studied and modeled in Culebra through the watershed management plan, and you can see some examples of that in the next slide, also with the nutrients. Next. So our main focus in the implementation of practices have been to reduce that sediment and those nutrient loads to the marine environment. And here are some examples of those small-scale green infrastructure projects that include coastal stabilization project, habitat restoration, habitat creation, and also coral propagation techniques with other NGOs partners. Next. In the purpose of isolating pollutant loads in Culebra, we have made the exercise of subdividing Culebra into all of its possible sub-watersheds. And with that analysis, we have created priority sites, priority sub-watersheds to work with. This has been an effort with a lot of partners, but mainly it's been a very collaborative effort between NOAA Restoration Center with our colleague Lisa Van Diver, who has been leading this process with Protectores de Cuencas for the past 10 years. Next. So we have divided the sub-watersheds into priorities, and then we have divided the road networks that are priority to be stabilized. Next. And with that, we have conducted an analysis with NOAA in order to make sure our investments and the funding, federal funding, are invested in the most priority areas to reduce sediment loads to marine environment. Next. Unpaved roads are very difficult to stabilize, particularly because they require a lot of maintenance. So we have made several agreements with homeowner associations where they exist in Culebra, so that they provide funding for maintenance at a yearly basis. Unfortunately, that's not the case for all the road networks. And even though they work better when you do these practices, I mean, we have tested several conservation practices in these dirt roads and now know the best that are working, and we have concentrated in those. We have a slide here also of concrete, because depending on the slope and depending on the near of the marine environment, concrete is now cataloged as a conservation practices, to implement sediment reduction. Concrete roads are very expensive, particularly in Culebra, but are the best way for the long term to reduce the sediment entering the marine environment. Of course, concrete by itself will not do the job. It has to be combined with the other conservation or nature-based solutions to reduce the energy of the water, to capture, to retain that water, because you don't want to transfer the problem of one road to another one, or one road to a gully, or one road to a wetland. So it's very expensive, but it's where you combine those practices with the concrete, they work very well. We also work very closely with several other organizations to develop unpaved road standards that is being used for the Caribbean and also for the Pacific. Next. When you talk about dirt road stabilization, you also need to work with the road bank stabilization. Sometimes when you do a lot of work in your road, which is mainly regrading, check dams, crossing pipes, reducing the energy of that water, diverting that water to forested areas, you also have to work with the banks to stabilize the banks of those roads. Next. We have had a lot of coastal stabilization projects that use green infrastructure, mainly to build public use infrastructure that is an improvement of the public use infrastructure, but the public use infrastructure also is the the conservation practice. For instance, a parking lot is now converted to a permeable parking, so it not only reduces pollutants coming from the car, it also serves as the filter for nearby sediment loads. Next. There's not a lot of space to deal and implement conservation practices, so we have to make sure that we take advantage of the areas, and we have an approach that we call the train approach. So each practice is helping the next practice to be able to, at the end of the discharge point, eliminate most of the pollutant loads as possible. So it's not just one conservation practice, it's not just one green infrastructure project, it's a combination of multiple projects. Next. We are also dealing with, at the moment, with identifying possible stormwater practices implementation. We have selected several sites that are going to be that we're going to be implementing with green infrastructure in the near future. Next. In terms of nutrients, we have an issue with the wastewater treatment plant in Culebra. Concentration loads of nutrients are still high, even if they have built a wetland system before the discharge of the plant. Nutrients are keeping high. We have designed and are close to develop an agreement with the Aqueduct Authority in Puerto Rico to implement floating treatment wetland in this system. Next. With this system, with the treatment wetland, we are hoping to reduce 25% or more of the total concentrations of nutrients before they are discharged into the marine environment. Next. Another technique for soil stabilization has been through hydroseeding. I know it's very challenging because you need a lot of water to irrigate and maintain the area, but hydroseeding can take effect in a matter of days. Instead of leaving it by itself, there could be months of sediment just running off to the marine environment. If you do a good hydroseeding work, in a matter of 15 to 20 days, you have 100% cover of vegetation. Next. We have other issues related to climate change. This road here, what you see is the PR 250 in Culebra. Is one of the main or most important road. It takes the cargo from the ferry, like all the food, the gas, and all the transportation that is needed to the population of Culebra. So this road is being in severe condition right now, and it's even worse than this time. So we have collaborated with NIFWIF, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and we have funding to develop. We are currently developing. Next, please. We are currently developing a nature-based engineering project here with the help of several engineers companies, including Tetra Tech. You can go to the next one. And Gregory Morris Engineering here. So our goal is to build some infrastructure that will not only help the road, but will also create habitat in the same project. So we are currently right now working in the preliminary design, and we have funding for phase 2, which will be final design and final environmental compliance. We are hoping to submit a proposal after that for final implementation. Next. We are also continuing monitoring our practices. We have done monitoring per practices to see how, with rain simulations, with the help of Dr. Ramos from the Austin, Texas University. So we have been testing each practice to see which practice will hold more sediment. Next. We are also conducting at the moment with the several funding sources, monitoring approach in general. So we will be installing sediment traps in the bay. We will be taking water samples at different locations, because at the watershed scale, we want to understand how these practices are going to be helping the marine environment. So we are also tracking sources of pollution by doing the illicit discharge detection and elimination process. Next. Additional to these projects, nationwide here in Puerto Rico, we are also involved in a lot of wetland restoration, coastal stabilization. I just brought some examples. We are also working reducing sediment in the upper high watersheds in the coffee farms to reduce the sediment load from coffee farm dirt roads. Next. This is most of our partners. If it was not for the participation of these partners, none of these projects could be completed. So we thank all of them and also the future partners to come. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. That is great. Actually, some of my research has been at a community forest in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, and a community forest acting as a nature-based solution forest, right? Afforestation and reforestation for flood mitigation. So super important work. That's great. I'll wait to see if there's any other questions. I do have some on my own also, but I guess your last slide there, you mentioned some of your partners, but I'm curious, trying to connect from the BRIC program that Sarah just spoke about, and we're going to hear a little bit more and a little bit from Rich Brown with Bank of America. I'm curious about what kind of funding sources or options that your group has applied for, maybe either locally, federally, to implement these projects.
Yeah, for Culebra, most of the funding, or the majority of the funding, have been provided by NOAA through the Coral Creek Conservation Program and the Restoration Center. After we started with the help of NOAA funding, other federal agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, NRCS have also been contributing to help reduce the stressors to coral reef, but it has been mainly federal. Municipality of Culebra also have collaborated. Of course, all of this federal funding needs matching contributions, so we have a chain of people and organizations that are helping us produce these matching contributions. But for future, I mean, we would like to find a good source. Maybe I just heard Sarah with the BRIC program. There could be probably an alternative. If we could find funding to do the majority of these dirt roads in concrete combined with these other conservation practices, we will have a maintain-free project for the near future. And then we can go to the municipality and say, let's put an ordinance that every new road has to use these standards. So that's our main goal. Federal funds are not going to last forever. We might not be able to work forever in Culebra, so we want to leave things as self-maintained as possible.
That's great. I was just thinking about that. Maybe this would be a good opportunity to leverage maybe BRIC grant funding for a future project. And then on one of your slides, you mentioned some community engagement efforts. So I'm curious about maybe how the community members have been involved with some of these projects. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, at the beginning, when the key thing was when we built the watershed management plan, it was a very community participative process. And after that, with the implementation, we have done the same approach. At the beginning, we were selling to the landowners, okay, if you do better practices in your dirt roads, you will reduce the cost of maintenance of these roads per year. If you don't do a good grading or a good work, they have to get heavy equipment there 2 or 3 times a year to regrade. Of course, that produces a lot of sediment and it goes directly to the bay. Once we started, it was difficult, but now we have people in line waiting for us to implement their practices, and they are now putting funding as a matching contribution to help us maintain and also to add additional road segments.
Okay, great, great. And it looks like we have one more question, last question here. Someone said the floating wetland idea is super interesting. Can you tell us more about its effectiveness as a filtration system?
Yeah, the thing is they have these wetlands that are very deep and nothing is growing in them. They're just using the sun as for getting rid of the bacteria, but the nutrients are not. So most of the nutrients are there. They come up in chlorophyll A, and then they will come down again as nutrients before they discharge to the bay. So our pilot project is to take one or two of these cells and put a floating structures with the vetiver grass on them, hoping that the vetiver grass roots that grow very dense and very fast will take a lot of these nutrients before discharging. We have funding also from NOAA to do that pilot project. And then depending how we're going to monitor, depending on how it works, we can expand to other cells. We have 5 cells in total that are already built, but are not doing a good job.
Wow.
It's like an improvement for that treatment, hopefully as a nature-based tertiary treatment.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you, Roberto, for being here, and thank you for sharing about this organization and all your great work. Great. Thanks. So next, we will hear from Blair Williams, who is a critical area permitting section manager with the South Carolina Coastal Management Program. So thank you, Blair, for being here with us today, and whenever you're ready. Thanks.
Thanks, Meredith, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Blair Williams. I work with South Carolina's Office of Ocean Coastal Resource Management. Today, I'm going to be speaking more from a regulatory permitting perspective at the state level. And so I just want to give a little bit of background here real quick. So as a quick background on South Carolina's coastal program, the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act was passed in 1972 as a voluntary program. South Carolina understood the importance of this program and passed the state's Coastal Tidelands and Wetlands Act in 1977. And that did basically 2 important things. It directed the coastal program to create its direct permitting authority and its indirect certification authority. So in 1978, the critical area permitting regulations were passed. And then in 1979, the Coastal Zone Management Plan for the certification authority was passed. Next slide, please. So this is a graphic of the department's certification authority over the 8 coastal counties. And under our certification authority, we are able to review all state and federal permit applications and deem it consistent with the Coastal Zone Management Program. Next slide. This graphic illustrates the department's direct permitting authority, which is essentially Highway 17 from Georgia to North Carolina and oceanward to a 3-mile demarcation. This jurisdictional area is where the department anticipates the majority of living shoreline applications. This is where we process individual permit applications in which the now living shoreline applications would be administered. Anything that may alter the 4 types of critical areas, such as the tidelands, coastal waters, beaches, or beach dunes within this direct permitting authority, has to come through our department for review as stewards managing that public trust property. Next slide, please. So living shorelines and the development of the regulations we're about to discuss are based on interest from coastal property owners and other stakeholders in South Carolina who expressed an increased interest in the use of living shorelines as an alternative to hardened erosion control structures within the estuarine environment. This interest is not only to apply living shorelines at the upland marsh interface, but also at eroding marsh edges on the riverine side. As background, previous regulations for bulkheads, 2003 and earlier, only discouraged the use of bulkheads and revetments. Since 2003 and until now, bulkheads and revetments are still allowed, but only after the property owners can demonstrate tidally induced erosion of upland and that there is not an adequate marsh buffer. It's important to note that traditional erosion control structures are only permitted along upland eroding shorelines. Additionally, the department is we're seeing an uptick in requests for bulkheads, not necessarily because of erosion, but because of flooding due to sea level rise. The Living Shoreline initiative the department undertook over the past multiple years shows how South Carolina's program is maturing by addressing hardening of shorelines in South Carolina. Next slide, please. So how did we get there? As mentioned, due to public interest, the department commenced the Living Shoreline initiative and worked in partnership with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources and South Carolina's 2 national estuarine research reserves to evaluate the performance of different living shoreline methods over time and under a range of environmental conditions. The department developed the definition and standards using scientific data and monitoring results from existing living shoreline installations in South Carolina and the input from state, local, federal agencies, the Living Shoreline Working Group, and additional stakeholder engagement. As a result of this effort, the department initiated the process of promulgating regulations. Next slide, please. So in order to promulgate regulations in the state of South Carolina, we fall under the Administrative Procedures Act. And then prior to the last legislative session, the Coastal Division regulations did not provide guidance specific for living shoreline installations. The lack of a regulatory definition or specific project standards for living shorelines resulted in longer permitting review times and uncertainties about the project performance. The living shoreline regulations allow for a more efficient authorization process by defining which projects qualify for living shoreline and establishing specific project standards for living shoreline installations. The definition and the standards that were developed help ensure a project design will accomplish its intended goals. And so the department published a notice of drafting in April of 2020. From that input, published a notice of proposed regulations through different stakeholder engagements. And then ultimately we got board approval in December of 2020, and then the General Assembly and Governor approval in May of 2021. So South Carolina's definition of a living shoreline is a shoreline stabilization approach utilized in intertidal wetland environments that maintains, restores, and/or enhances the natural estuarine processes through the strategic placement of native vegetation and/or use of green infrastructure as described in Regulation 30-12Q. Living shorelines promote the wetland resiliency and water quality and enhance the diverse intertidal habitats. So the department wanted this to be a broad definition that allows for a multitude of soft or green techniques which mimic the natural process at both the marsh riverine shoreline interface and marsh upland shoreline interface. Again, we're seeing a lot of interest in a proactive approach from the public and some local governments in installing living shorelines at the eroding marsh edge rather than an eroding upland edge. Next slide, please. So in addition to the regulatory definition, there was a set of regulatory standards that were developed and now are part of our framework when reviewing living shoreline applications and determining whether a living shoreline would be permissible or not. And so these new specific project standards are found in our critical area permitting regulations under 30-12Q. And they guide staff in reviewing applications and determining, addresses things such as materials. So what type of material is being used, and looking at using native species, including plants, and then the requirement of may be that a certified letter from the supplier of the native plants would be required as part of that process. Well, regulations also considered other resource impacts, conflict of use, such as recreational uses or commercial uses that may exist in that area. An example of that would be, if it's in an area where it's already leased for shellfish harvesting and how it may impact that oysterman that's going out there and harvesting oysters. It also looks at shoreline ecological processes. Does the living shoreline project maintain, enhance, or restore the natural environment? How does it maintain that water upland interface? Does it promote the growth of native species? How does it impact the movement of aquatic organisms between the water body across the marsh, if present, and into the shore? And then also we address the maintenance component as it relates to living shoreline installations. We want to ensure these structures are staying intact and functional and performing as they are intended to do. The process is going to include monitoring, but we kept the requirements for monitoring pretty broad. And when we issue permits, we have the ability to special condition our permits. And since sites can be very dynamic and different among each other, we wanted the ability to be able to tailor those monitoring requirements within that permit for each living shoreline installation. It also allows, the regulation allows to address remediation and removal. So if a living shoreline structure becomes no longer functional or successful, we have the ability to have that structure modified or even removed. So it doesn't become, like marine debris and whatnot. And then lastly, we are requiring folks to submit pre-application requests for meetings, and we'll meet with those folks to manage those expectations, to also inform applicants of those permitting requirements, but also sure that the area that they're proposing, the location of that living shoreline installation, is suitable for a living shoreline before investing a lot of time and energy and a cost into that project. And then next slide. Next steps. Actually, we just kicked off our first next step here of contractor training and certification. We're currently in the planning and development stage of that effort. Ultimately, we want to offer a program that can train contractors or whoever may be installing these living shorelines and have a certification program for them. And then lastly, the department has a goal of developing a general permit for living shorelines to incentivize it and also further expedite that permitting process for those individuals wishing to come in for a living shoreline project. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you, Blair. Thanks so much. We do have one question here. Can you tell us maybe what is the biggest benefit of having a regulatory definition?
I think I think there's many benefits. I think it really, this was really generated through stakeholder input and the interest raised by the public, but it helps distinguish, I think, between your gray and green type infrastructure projects, and it really steers folks to that true natural-based solution in addressing different type of, whether you're addressing sea level rise or an erosion event. It really helps guide individuals into that true nature-based solution for addressing those issues.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to keep things moving, but since we're getting to the end of our session and the end of our meeting, I'm going to pass things over to our last speaker, Rich Brown with Bank of America. And I'm going to have Rich. Rich, are you still there?
I am here. Can you hear me, Meredith?
Yes. Maybe I can get a confirmation from Lindy. Are you there? Maybe you can get a confirmation if you can hear Rich okay.
Yes, all clear. Thank you.
Okay, great. So finally, our last presenter of our session is Richard Brown, who is the Senior Vice President and Environmental Program Director of Bank of America. So thank you, Rich. We look forward to your presentation.
Well, Meredith, thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to participate today. And I apologize that I'm not on the video, but we had some issues with that. At any rate, I'm really pleased to be here because as we look at these things kind of big picture, there's not a single government solution. There's not a single nonprofit solution to these questions of resilience and disaster preparedness and and adaptation and all the things that we're trying to do. And there's not a single private sector solution to that either. But by combining resources, there's a lot we can get done. And we've just heard a lot, really a lot of great programs and a lot of great commitment and focus on these issues. And so Meredith, if you can go to move off of the title slide and move to the first slide, maybe you're already there. And I went slide light today. I'll save you from a whole litany of slides. And but there's a couple things that I want to do today. I want to talk a little bit about big picture, some big picture issues here that are, and it's mostly good news, I would say. And then I want to talk a little bit about a partnership that Bank of America has with the Nature Conservancy, because it's addressing some of the issues and including some issues in the Caribbean that I know some of you are interested in. So that's kind of what I want to do today in the limited amount of time that I have. But let's start with the big picture here. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the big climate summit that happened back in November. It was in Glasgow, Scotland, known as COP26. And there's still a lot of evaluation. Was COP a success or not a success? And there was the primary purpose of the COP was for nations from all across the globe to come together and primarily to commit to what their country will do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the primary purpose of COP. But there was some interesting things that came out of it. And one of them is the broad recognition of the value of nature-based solutions. And that, I think it reiterates a theme that I've heard from the previous speakers on the panel, is that there's nature-based solutions have so many co-benefits. In many cases, you have something that will reduce carbon emissions or act as a carbon sink and collect carbon. But they're also providing these biodiversity benefits or resilience benefits. And so there was really some broad recognition of the value of that. And I think that's going to benefit really worldwide adaptation and mitigation issues, and as we move forward. And in fact, one of the things that came out of the COP was something, it's called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Risk Disclosures. And while I'm not a great fan of acronyms, this is important because what it is doing is bringing members of the finance community together, banks and asset managers and others, to really figure out how and address both the risks inherent with extreme weather risks and rising sea risk and a lot of those kinds of issues. But also the built-in opportunities here to invest in nature-based solutions and thereby reduce risk. And so that is not something that had really been addressed in the previous climate summits. And so that was a big win, I would say. If you a reality check here is the current investments globally, are still falling far short of what's required, really to make meaningful contribution to address climate change and some of these other mitigating some of the other risks that we've been talking about today. And part of this, lack of investment can be attributed to some of the uncertainties and the risks and the rules of nature-based solutions. And some of this gets into the, there's issues related to the integrity of certain assets that might be used as carbon offsets. There was earlier a little bit of discussion around afforestation and things like that that can provide resilience solutions, but also can part of the way to finance these things is by engaging in carbon offset markets. And there's been some questions about carbon offset markets, and I don't really have time to get into all of that. But I think as we validate some of the benefits, the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions, that is going to help drive more investment, particularly more private investment, into some of these solutions. And so that, and that leaves, I would say that leaves me, and I think it left many that were at the COP with, a sense of optimism that there's this scientific and technological advancement that's happening. It's going to help us better understand the co-benefits of nature-based solutions. And as we understand the co-benefits of nature-based solutions, that is going to drive more private capital into these solutions. And a lot of this is going to need to be done in what is sometimes referred to as blended capital. And blended capital is really when you can bring together some maybe private equity that is a higher risk capital, but then you have some capital from maybe some regional development banks, and then you have some capital from traditional banks, and then maybe some other government type capital, and you layer these all in, and that is how we're going to show what works. And as we learn what works, whether it's a carbon sequestration natural-based solution, or perhaps something that has that, but also has co-benefits of building resilience around extreme weather or flooding or other issues, that is going to drive a lot more action in this area. So, I would just say that I think what the private sector is going to continue to look for is some, the government's helping setting up frameworks so that we can understand in the private sector how best to drive our investment. And there actually is a biodiversity conference, kind of a COP, but just for biodiversity, that's going to happen later this year. And that, again, will bring many, many countries together to really talk about some of these issues. And I think, and part of that effort will be to develop this framework, and that'll be really helpful. So Meredith, let's move on to the next slide.
Okay.
So I want to talk a little bit about a partnership that Bank of America has with the Nature Conservancy, because it is focused in part on some activities that are happening in the region, particularly in the Caribbean. But Bank of America, our focus is on building sustainable financial solutions. As I mentioned earlier, there's not enough government money to do this alone. There's not enough philanthropy to do it alone. There's not enough private sector funding to do it alone. But if we can all come together and build some sustainable financial solutions, then we can really make some progress. And so that is kind of, I would say, is the foundation of our partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It's really trying to develop these scalable and finance-oriented strategies to expand nature-based, particularly coastal flood solutions that can help restore abundant fisheries and reduce the threats to lives and homes and infrastructure. One of the ways that the Nature Conservancy is doing this, and in partnership with Bank of America, and certainly with some other partners as well, is what are known as blue bonds. And TNC recently closed a blue bond deal with the country of Belize. And what this means, it's actually a restructuring of the sovereign debt of the nation. And as they restructure the debt, and it saves in this case Belize, it saves them money, and they're going to owe less on their national debt. But as a part of that deal, Belize committed to conserving 30% of their ocean area. And so this is an effort that has been done in several different countries, but the focus is really on freeing up funds and then devoting those to nature-based solutions, including ocean health and in some cases resilience programs to protect both marine ecosystems as well as the ecosystems on land and protection of human life as well. So this is an exciting kind of new financial approach, and we do see this expanding significantly in the future. I know that Nature Conservancy is very interested in the opportunities here, and the private sector, including Bank of America, we're looking at these things and want to see where we can step in and try to play a role as well. Another part of this initiative is this partnership that we have with the Nature Conservancy is something called the Resilient Islands Initiative. And this is a partnership that also has brought in the International Federation of the Red Cross. And the goal of this initiative is to really encourage the national governments in the region to reduce flood risks and coastal erosion by protecting and restoring mangroves and coral reefs across these countries. And then by bringing in the International Federation of the Red Cross, which was, I think as we all know, is often tasked with picking up the pieces after there has been an extreme weather event or other natural disaster. The idea is to give them a leg up on this and ideally reduce the risks and therefore the impact on the people of the region, the physical structures in the region, and the marine and other ecosystems as well. And so as a part of this effort, they're doing programs in the Dominican Republic, in Grenada, and in Jamaica. And I don't have time to get into all the details of those, but there's a lot going on there. I know we're running up against time here, so I'm going to just wrap up with there's a final tool, another interesting, innovative financial tool that's being used to address resilience, and that's Reef Insurance. And so there was a pilot program in Mexico, in Quintana Roo, in that state, and they actually is working with the Nature Conservancy and with support from Bank of America and others, came up with a reef insurance policy. And so if a storm hits and it's a certain level of storm, the insurance automatically will pay out, and then it is immediately a crew is dispatched to try to go out and repair the coral reef, which, as we all know, is providing protection, but they can get damaged in those extreme weather events. And there's also some talk about doing this with mangroves as well, because depending upon the ecosystem, mangroves may be the thing that's providing the coastal protection. And so there may be an opportunity to come up with some sort of mangrove insurance policy as well. So that's just a couple of examples of, I think, innovative financial structuring that's happening, that's combining private sector capital with government sector capital and NGO know-how, and bringing all of this together in a way that I think is going to move us forward in exciting ways in the future. So I will stop there, Meredith, and happy to answer any questions.
Great,
if
thanks.
we have time for those.
Yes, we have, well, it just turned 4 o'clock on the dot, but maybe just one question just to wrap up everything and to wrap up this session would be maybe what are some challenges that maybe you've come across, and what are some lessons learned with some of these projects when we move forward and try to implement and establish more of these nature-based solutions?
Well, the challenge is that in some cases, we're still kind of early days in trying to figure out and really demonstrate what works. And so, to my earlier comment, as we get more and more proof points that, expanding mangroves can help with coastal protection, with rebuilding coral reefs if they get damaged, but rebuilding them and showing that they can continue to protect coastlines, and if there, all these other nature-based solutions, as we do more of them, we're going to see what works, and then the investment will flow. I think both government investment, but also private sector investment will go, because the private sector has a great interest in certainly in ensuring that private property and whether it's a manufacturing facility or anything else, that they don't get damaged. And certainly if a company has employees in a certain area, they want to make sure that their whole community is safe. So that, I think, is the great opportunity that we have.
Agreed. I think that's a great way to wrap up this session and a great note to end on. Again, this nature-based solution is a new kind of buzzword, but it's not a new concept, right? But how are we bringing it back to this resilience and disaster resilience spaces? So thank you so much to all of our panelists for this session. It was really great, and I'm going to hand things off to Lindy, who will give our closing remarks.
Great, thank you so much. Meredith, you can share that one last slide and put the links in the chat as I talk. That would be really fantastic. I wanted to just thank you so much for joining us for the 2022 SCDRP annual meeting. The last 2 days have been incredibly inspiring and educational. And oh my goodness, sorry, my computer just messed up a little bit. I'm sorry. The last 2 days have been incredibly inspiring and educational through